Good morning, everyone. Today I am sharing the results of my overwintering potato planting experiment. For those of you who missed the original video, here is a quick recap. So I tried planting overwintered potatoes for the first time in my Zone 6A Ohio garden back in 2021 with pretty abysmal results. But in the fall of 2022, I had quite a few little potatoes in storage that were already sprouting, that weren't going to get eaten, that I didn't want to go to waste. So I decided to ask you all for suggestions on how you grew overwintered potatoes. I got some really good recommendations and decided to try a couple of them out. So I planted my sprouting potatoes out at the beginning of December using 4 different methods. The first group I tried in a raised bed again. That was what I did the first year out, but I moved them to a bed that I thought had a little bit better soil quality. But unfortunately, the results this year were even worse than my 2021 efforts. I'm not entirely sure what to chalk these poor yields up to, but I suspect it's largely because the raised beds dry out too fast and I didn't water, as well as some competition from other plants in the bed. The one positive to this test is that these plants were the very first to sprout out and start growing in the spring, which makes sense as the soil in my raised beds is quicker to warm up in the spring than the soil in my in-ground beds. I also wanted to try some folks' suggestions for growing overwinter potatoes, though I had to tweak the methods a little bit based on my own growing area and the supplies I had on hand. The first recommendation came from Mark in Zone 7A, who has had great results growing overwintered potatoes. His method is to dig a trench deep enough to keep the potatoes below the frost line. Next, place a good layer of straw in the bottom of the trench. I used alfalfa hay as that's what I had on hand. Then place the potatoes on top of the straw or hay. Next, put another layer of straw or hay on top of the potatoes and then cover with dirt. And then mulch again with straw or leaves. The second recommendation came from Adrienne, though I had to tweak her method quite a bit. Adrienne is in Zone 8B, so her days during this time of year are warmer and longer than mine would typically be, and her method is for actively growing potatoes during those winter months. I wanted my potatoes to be sitting in kind of a semi-dormant state through the winter and resume growth in the spring. Hence the tweaking of the methods a bit. So first, we dig our trench deep and wide, at least a foot down and 3 feet wide. Next, put a good layer of almost ready compost down, and then plain cardboard in the middle 18 inches of the trench. Then put a thin layer of really good quality garden soil in that middle 18 inches only, and put the potatoes right in the middle. Then we cover these with more dirt. Next, in 5 inches on both sides of our trench, we put compost that's almost ready but not quite. And on the outside 4 inches, put down some hot compost. Now this is where I started to diverge from the original instructions. I didn't want the extra heat from hot compost as I wasn't trying to actively grow them in the winter. So I didn't use brand new hot chicken litter like she'd recommended. I used some aged chicken litter that's about half composted already. And then we cover the entire thing with hay or straw. I used leaf mulch as that is what I had on hand. And finally, because I had some extra potatoes sitting around and was getting tired of planting, I just kind of tossed them in the ground with no extra care to see how those did. So let's fast forward to this spring. The in-ground potatoes took forever to sprout up and start growing. I was certain for the longest time that critters like voles had eaten them all and I was going to get nothing. But by early June, my plants had put on some decent growth. but the emergence was definitely sporadic. There were clearly places where no potatoes had sprouted or grown. And the strangest thing of all is that all of my potatoes in those 2 experimental plots didn't grow in the line where I planted them. They had all moved about a foot over. My only guess is that critters did get in there and kind of shift things around, but I really don't have a great explanation as to what was going on there. But the potatoes that did sprout and grow did put on a lot of nice, healthy top growth. Now, typically with my potatoes, I wait until that foliage starts to really die back before I dig. But the potatoes in the raised bed got a little ahead of me, and that foliage was completely dead by the time I got around to digging. I dug these on July 24th, and this harvest was sad, though I did get 1 decent-sized purple Viking tuber in the mix. And so I don't forget to mention, I did use a mix of whatever I had on hand to plant these beds out. So it was some Baltic Rose, some purple Viking, and then a yellow. I'm thinking it was most likely Yukon Gem. Next to die back were the plants in that shallow trench, the one where I just threw the potatoes in the ground with no extra care. These died off by the 3rd week of July. A rather sad production here as well. Now, curiosity was killing me, and even though the plants in the 2 experimental plantings had not started to die back yet, I couldn't help myself. I ended up digging the front half of those plantings that same day, that 3rd week of July. And I was rather discouraged by my results at this point. Here's the trench and straw hay method. And here's the trench and compost method. I let the remainder of the plantings set for another 2 weeks. The plants still weren't dying back, but I made the decision to dig all of my spring potatoes as we're getting pretty far into the season, and once temperatures get so high, potatoes won't set any additional tubers anyway. So with very low expectations, I dug the rest of the experimental plantings. And I got a pleasant surprise. I dug the remainder of the plants on August 4th. For whatever reason, the plants toward the back of the planting yielded much better. In fact, they yielded as well as my spring planted spuds. So all in all, what did I end up with? Here's the yield from the raised bed. The yield from the no extra attention, just throw them in the ground bed. The yield from Mark's method, the trench and hay/straw. And the yield from Adrian's method, the trench and compost method. And now compare that to my typical spring plantings, which were done via the traditional trench and hill method. Now there are a couple of points I think that it's important to mention here as well. This spring was not a good year for potatoes here in my area overall. So even in my spring plantings where I was growing varieties that have been proven high yielders for me, I saw decreases in yields this year. We had a couple of factors going on, but a lot of it was the weather. So it's likely that these overwintered potatoes actually have the potential for higher yields in a better year. Another point is that none of these plantings, the raised bed, the throw in the ground, or the 2 experimental methods, were given any supplemental care. So I did not water and I did not fertilize, other than the compost that was put in at the beginning of the planting. Typically with my spring planted potatoes, I will try to water them if we're having super dry weather. And I typically always do a side dress with compost and or Gardens Alive's potato food. So these were really just throw them in the ground and forget them. The other thing that I didn't do that I would typically do with spring planted potatoes is mulch them really well. I did not stay on top of the mulching, and I'll typically use things like straw, hay, grass clippings, leaf mulch. And you can see that in some of these potatoes that have this greening on them. So this is where they were exposed to sunlight. And that's not ideal either. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I also used a mix of varieties. So I think it's hard to get a clear picture of the full yield potential. In hindsight, I wish that I would have used a proven producer for me, something like my favorites, Baltic Rose or Purple Viking. But at the time that I did my planting, I was more concerned with just using up whatever was sprouting and seeing if this method would even work in general. And one final thing worth noting was that the overwintered potatoes did not give me harvest any earlier than my spring planted potatoes. So the exception was the raised bed planting. But in all likelihood, if I had spring planted in a raised bed, that harvest would have been earlier as well. So an earlier harvest is not an advantage of this type of planting, at least here for me in Ohio. So what are my takeaways from this experiment? I think for me personally, if I have potatoes that have sprouted in storage come early December, and if I have some beds that are just sitting open that I don't need for anything the coming spring, I'll probably continue to do this. I'd like to continue to tweak my methods and kind of see what works and what doesn't. I also want to figure out what the heck was going on with the mysterious moving potato planting. And I'll definitely be more diligent about keeping these mulched. But I do think this method has some pretty good potential. Now, if you plant potatoes for overwintering and have some tips to share, I'd love it if you drop a line in the comments below and let me know. And if you enjoyed today's video, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.